And now, it is my great honor to give the floor to Kevin Hyland, Ireland representative to the Council of Europe Independent Group of Experts for Trafficking and Senior Advisor to the Santa Marta Group. Kevin, thank you very much for being with us tonight. You have the floor.
Thank you. And if you are hearing me now, I hope you are.
Good.
Perhaps maybe the slides was causing the problem. So good to speak to you all around the world. And really, I think Olivia spoke of this in a very clear way. We have had for 20 years a commitment, and our commitment should not be any less than any other global commitment we have. And if we look at the extent of how the climate change has progressed and the commitment to end that, or to change the climate issues, we need to have the same resourcing and accountability attached to human trafficking and modern slavery. And when we look at the figures of 40 million people and 151 million children in labor exploitation or labor conditions that are unacceptable, we then start to realize the true magnitude of this issue. And this isn't something that's new. If we look, we have legislation and crimes and promises that go right back to 326 BC. And various times in the world, whether that was in the transatlantic slave trade or other times where there was a commitment that we would end this. But yet people and the commodification of people for cheap labor or for fun or for exploitation has continued. And now we're looking at a commercial enterprise that generates at least 150 billion US dollars a year. So with all these commitments, with UN protocols, Council of Europe, EU directives, and many other international commitments, why is it this crime continues? And we now see is expanding, and particularly with COVID. One of the big problems is the marginalized and the vulnerable have become more marginalized and more vulnerable, and it starts to reflect on us. We, as the current incumbents of this planet, have allowed this to happen. So we, as the current incumbents, have got the duty to end this. But that can't be done by words. It has to be done by action. So if we look at all the commitments around the world, all the legislation, all the policy that's there, we see, as I've said, we have the Council of Europe, we have EU directives, we have OSCE commitments and guidance, we have UN human rights, and we have the SDGs, we have the G20 commitment, we have the G7 commitments, and we have legislation in most countries in the world. But still, this is a prosperous crime. And if we took prosecutions, we often hear that you're not going to prosecute your way out of this. And I'm a former police officer, and I would accept that. Any serious crime issue, you need more than just prosecutions. You need to factor it out of your environment. But you do need to have prosecutions when you've got 40 million people in the world who are suffering. Because if you are making money, and there's nothing stopping you from making money out of the exploitation of people, you will continue. This isn't something that happens in isolation. It happens within serious and organized crime. And if we look at the convictions for 2019, which are the last figures available, we're talking about 9,548 convictions across the world. That's against 40 million victims. It hardly registers. And only 498 were convicted for forced labor. And if we look at the prosecutions, they have started to go down. So we're going to see fewer convictions. And of course, COVID is going to have an impact on that as well. And if we look at the victims identified through official channels, it's 118,000, which out of 40 million doesn't even come to 1%. So there's a 99.98% chance of impunity and a 99% chance of not getting identified. Those are the figures to remember, and that is why this crime is so prosperous. And if we took the UK, for example, where I was commissioner, if we look at systems, it has a national referral mechanism required under the Council of Europe Convention. But if we look at statistics and figures, the people going into that system who reach out for help, there was just under 11,000 in 2019. Yet at the end of the year, there were more people waiting for a decision than had entered into the year because of a backlog from previous years. And this year going forward, there will be in the region of 15 to 16,000 people waiting for a decision, some as many as 2 or 3 years, as to whether they are a victim of human trafficking and modern slavery. When I was a police officer, we would make decisions about other issues, whether someone was a victim of rape or child abuse or serious crime or burglary or robbery, normally within minutes, sometimes hours, but always within a few days in a complex case. So why is it taking so long in human trafficking? Is it because there's immigration issues? Very much so. Is it because it's seen as complex? Or is it also because the wrong decision makers are involved? In the UK, for example, it is the Home Office who makes the decisions. This isn't something against the Home Office, but where do they fit in the process of making decisions about whether someone is a victim of crime or whether someone is vulnerable? It's not their work. So I've suggested that this should be something that is run with partnership between civil society, the NGOs, the police, and other statutory agencies, including health and also housing, etc., and education, so that everything the victims need, in particular children, can be picked up in that process. But year on year, the list is getting longer and the services are getting fewer. For example, in the UK system, a pregnant woman who is a trafficked woman gets an additional £3 a week. £3 a week on top of her £39. That is the value placed on a pregnant, trafficked woman. And we need to start talking about these issues and asking and holding to account systems and processes. So what is there that is going to make her life better? What is there that's going to help her, if it were the case, to assist in a prosecution? What is going to help her and her child exit their exploitation, even though they've stepped forward and gone for help in a very wealthy country? But if we look at human trafficking and modern slavery, we know, and I'm sure Brian will talk about this, in supply chains, complex as it may be, or in business models. And it can be at grassroots, in car washes and nail bars, which are seen very often in European countries, or in the fields of East Anglia in the UK, or perhaps in Southeast Asia. But also we see it, as we've seen recently, in cocoa supply, in clothing, and in mica. But also we need to be aware, what is the bigger causes of this? And as we are looking for a better climate, something I fully endorse, that means we need more power for batteries. So that means in the Democratic Republic, more children are going down the mines to mine for the materials in the supply chains of companies who are making billions of dollars profit. So we need to start asking where the accountability is. And yes, we need aid projects, we need assistance, but actually we need to be saying to businesses, what is it you are doing? When businesses do their procurement or source their materials, they will have complex processes. They will have teams of people. But when it comes to their supply chain transparency and ensuring that there isn't modern slavery, what do? Who do they have inspecting it? When they do supply chain statements, as required in the UK and now in Australia, what is it those actually contain? And in the UK example, you can actually do a supply chain statement saying you're doing nothing, or it can be a letter or a document that's written very superficially. But you don't have teams on the ground You don't actually go and check your supply chain, which is what is needed. And if you look in the UK earlier this year, there was an expose about a major trafficking situation in Leicestershire, in the centre of England, where it was identified hundreds and potentially thousands of women in particular and girls were being exploited, making garments for distribution across the world. One of the companies exposed was called Boohoo, and they were subject of an investigation by the police, by the National Crime Agency, by the Gangmasters Labour Abuse Authority, and they commissioned one themselves. All that mentioned there were problems. Boohoo accepted that. But at the end of the year, their shares went up by 40%. They bought high street chains out because of the COVID issues. And now they're saying really nothing has really changed in Leicester. So we need to say, what is the accountability of what is going on in the ground, and who should make that happen? Well, I think it should be governments, but it should be businesses, and policy should make sure of that. If we look here, for example, this is how we can step into the world of human trafficking without knowing it. Last year, before COVID, it was identified that rubber gloves being made for the National Health Service and other healthcare providers were being made at the hands of exploiters and trafficked people in Malaysia. And that a charity concert by the Spice Girls, a British girls group, the tops they made for the charity money were made in forced labour and child labour. These supply chains were not being checked and actually ended up being used in events that were about charity or about life-saving. When I spoke about the rubber gloves to the International Council of Nursing, when they held their event in Singapore, when there's 20 million representatives of that group, they were absolutely outraged that the hands that were being exploited were the very hands that were making the gloves for them to wear in operating theatres or in life-saving situations. But also, when we come to sex trafficking, in London alone, these were operations that I led as a police officer. There was one organised gang making £20,000 a day. £20,000 a day out of trafficking women and girls. And these were coming from all over the world, but mainly Eastern Europe. And they were keeping them in high-end premises, and their customers were plenty. And of course, running operations like this, you require lots of resources. But sometimes the resources you need to think about in a strange way. And as this is the Knights of Malta, it's very pleasing to be able to say that it was religious sisters who started a partnership working with me in the Metropolitan Police, who could give a completely different approach. And this was reported on by the media. Because when we would go into these premises, the religious sisters would be able to assist and take the women to safety in their houses with specially trained officers. But this was all professional. It wasn't ad hoc. It wasn't hoping. And on some cases, and in one case in particular, this ended up with the religious sisters helping us in the morning at 6 a.m. on a Saturday morning. And by their assistance and the trust that was formed with the victim, by midday, I had the traffickers in custody. And they had raped one of the victims only that morning. But my job was to pursue the criminals, to find the evidence, to use other things, as Olivia said, not just victim testimony, surveillance, information data, financial evidence, DNA, covert deployments, infiltration, money laundering, all those things I would use in a case, which is why then we were getting over 100 prosecutions a year in London alone. But now across the whole of the UK, there aren't those levels of prosecutions. In fact, they may be only 50% across the whole of the UK. But we had different ways of doing it, working with people who had the asset and the professionalism to make sure we were making a difference, but realizing what each of our job was. As the police, we're not social workers. The religious sisters weren't the police, and they knew that. And when I wanted financial evidence, I went to financial experts, not to a charity or an NGO. When I needed specialist aerial shots, I went to our helicopter division. When I needed DNA, I would go to our forensic teams. And everybody had a role to play, from the statutory and the non-government organisations. And it worked well. Nowadays, I see there's a bit of a mess. Who's doing what? The ingredients are there, but they're being put in the wrong way. So the recipe isn't working. I want to talk about the Santa Marta group, because this was an unusual project. And in a way, perhaps I'm contradicting what I just said about the ingredients. This was a really strange meeting of bringing police chiefs and bishops and civil society together. And it was Pope Francis who launched it in 2014. But what the Santa Marta group was about providing the services and what the church could offer. And that was in actual the membership of the church, but also what asset was there. So the one thing we saw was the church can actually offer accommodation and support and accompaniment. But also, particularly with the Vatican and the level of the Catholic Church being a state, it can use diplomacy. And with organizations like the Knights of Malta and connections to Geneva and the UN, all those become very useful. And starting to educate and raising the awareness in a really effective way. But the real thing about the Santa Marta group was about trying to get people to use all their asset for what they can do, particularly with the police from my side, reminding police chiefs that it is all your assets, all your covert techniques, all your specialist investigation systems, all your money laundering, use all that. But if you add this additional piece that you can now have from civil society, and in particular with Santa Marta group from the church, that can be the added, the business sector. Faith groups and faith are big investors. So actually start to think about your investment and where your investment is going. The other thing is the Catholic Church is a big procurer of services. And the G20 has committed to procurement and looking at governments. Obviously, not all countries, and the Vatican certainly isn't a member of the G20. But what we see in Australia is that the Archbishop of Sydney and the Catholic Church in Australia is now looking at its own supply chain. So looking inwards as well, looking at what they're doing. So the Santa Marta group also was something that brought about SDG 8.7. I had drafted 8.7 and I couldn't get traction. My own government in the UK was very keen to push it forward, but was coming up against obstructions. So I went over to the Vatican, and then with a meeting with Pope Francis, he said he would endorse it and support it. Having him, bearing in mind he was going to launch the SDGs, actually made it happen. And very much with the support of the Pontifical Academy, Argentina, the UK government, and then Ireland and Kenya, we really got all 193 countries to sign up to a commitment of SDG 8.7. So that goal and that target remains. And what we really need to think about is we've committed by 2025, we're going to eradicate the worst forms of child labour and child soldiers. That's only 4 years away. We're nowhere near getting near that target because we haven't focused in as we should. We are not holding accountable those who are playing a role in making money out of trafficking. I believe that there are a number of organisations domestically that have to play a role in ending this. We need to look at it as a crime, a human rights issue, a money-making machine. But unless we have multi-agency approaches, so the justice system, which is police, courts, other access like labour inspectorates, all of those have to have a role to play. But also the unions. They are crucial in this, enabling people to report. particularly in business and in big companies. But we need the health sector, because more victims engage with health than with any other sector. But we need local authorities, including the education system, so that it's something that is inbred or integrated into the daily activities that we do. We need the transport systems, business and trade, and civil society. And the reason I want to see this to happen is because we need this integrated into our society. If we looked at things like education, it's not that long ago, particularly here in Ireland, when everybody didn't have the right to education. It was something that if you were of a certain class, you had it. And it's only in the 1967 when education up to the age of 16 became the right of everybody. That's not that long ago, but it's now integrated into a system. It's now there, universally available to whoever you are. And that system is big because it's not just talking about going to school. It's about a whole system of government. It's about governance. It's about further education, and it's developed. If we look at road safety, it wasn't that long ago that many countries didn't have driving licenses. You just bought a car and drove it. But now there's a whole system around road safety, around the tires, around the qualification of the driver, around, alcohol, around speeding, around dangerous driving, around laws, around the quality of the build of a car, around the emissions, all of that, because it's integrated into society at every part. We need to do that with human trafficking and modern slavery. But at the moment, it's a bit of a gimmick in some ways, perhaps not the right term to use, but it needs to be integrated in what the state is doing and what the state shouldn't do. And the accountability needs to be robust. And then the incentives to be not involved in this need to be great, whether that's tax breaks or whether it's just that to do this costs so much that you wouldn't risk doing it. I think we have got a chance to eradicate modern slavery if we take serious steps. And to do that, I think there are a number of steps we need to take. First of all, we need to make sure all governments, as was committed by the G20, which does, can have 85% of the world's economy in it, they said they would make sure that their procurement and their business were free of slavery. Well, let's start seeing that happen. What does that mean? Governments spend $1 in every $5 around the world and generate far more. Well, they need to make sure when they're spending our taxpayers' money, so it's our money, that money isn't ending up in the hands of criminals. And that means good, robust procurement systems where they make sure that those who are in a position to do business with and trade have done all they can to make sure that their supply chain is free of slavery. I know criminals operate quickly and they may breach a system, just like fraud, just like corruption. But think of the way we approach corruption. It's very positive, as in, if you get involved in it, there's a price to pay. Tainted money. I think we need to go one step further than proceeds of crime. If we had a notion whereby if money was tainted by modern slavery in the commercial sense, it should be taken. It should be stripped from you. And that money should be then used to fund anti-slavery activities, first of all, reparation. At the moment, the world commits less than $1 billion globally each year to modern slavery. Less than $1 billion, yet the criminals are making 150 billion. So if we started to strip that 150 billion and turn that into good money, for example, so much of that is gone out of people's pockets who are working as migrants, working elsewhere. And they would be sending remittances home to their families so their families could live well and go to school, the children. But because the remittances aren't going back, that is then becoming money for criminals. So if we created this notion of tainted money, just think the difference we could make. Olivia spoke about the internet. Well, the internet could be free of exploitation if we made it a requirement of the companies and the businesses. We need to place the law on them to make sure that their networks are free of exploitation and trafficking and other crimes. These are organizations that make billions a year. And when I was recently at the Vatican with the 5 big IT companies, they presented on what they're doing to deal with this challenge. And one was developing an app which was going to parents so that they would know how to advise their children on how to and not to use the internet and how to put in parental controls. I spoke afterwards and I said, you are placing the responsibility of your failure to control the internet onto the parent who has got 5 kids, who is having to work, and some of the most marginalized. You are creating an app for the mother or the father to then take the responsibility for your failings. I said, you should feel disgraced. And how much is that costing? It didn't even get to 6 figures. They need to invest billions on making sure that the internet is safe. This is a highway that they are making money from. If our highways where we live were infested by pedophiles and people trying to pick up our children, we would want to see action. We would call on the government or whoever had responsibility. So let's start asking them to be responsible for the safeguarding of people on the internet. And let's not get locked into the fact that they say it's the freedom of speech. I'm completely behind the human rights and the freedom of speech and the freedom of expression, but that no way includes human trafficking or the exploitation of children. No way near. And we need to be strong about this. I also think international instruments need to be used in the new age. The 1926 Slavery Convention didn't think about the internet or flight or things like that. We need to not perhaps rewrite them because that might take too long, but we need to revamp them, modernize them, make them relevant. I think multilateral agencies need to play their role. The international criminal courts need to be more involved. We need to get the World Food Programme involved, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and other parts of the UN, just to make sure that we are having impact. For example, if you are doing trades and the World Bank is involved, they should be demanding that there is no slavery in that supply chain. And if we've got the other thing of tainted money, if it's found, you're going to lose that investment. I also think one of the main things that we need to do, and meetings like today and the leadership of Michel Vouthi and others, particularly from the Knights of Malta and across the world that I see, we need to reset the moral compass. We're learning about that now with COVID. We tried to talk about COVID and every second word was economy. It took us a little bit of a while to realize actually, if you protect the people, the economy will look after itself. But we were looking after the economy first. What we need to do, modern slavery and human trafficking is developed and designed by human beings. And we need to make that possibility not a possibility. We're doing it with COVID, with some strict rules and regulations. Sometimes they're draconian, but sometimes they're necessary. But when I think about human trafficking, I always revert back to the people I've met, whether it's the young woman I met, a girl of 14, who was in Italy, in southern Italy, who had been moved or had come all the way to Libya. She had left Eritrea because of fear of rape and exploitation when she had been joined the army, which was mandatory. But when she got to Libya, she was then kept in a connection house and raped every day for 3 months before she had enough money to get on a boat to go across to Italy. And when she arrived, there was nothing for her really. She had such humility and she was so thankful for the small help she was getting, but her life had been shattered. She told me about seeing people floating in the sea. This was a 14-year-old girl. And then I see the Nigerian woman I met who had leprosy. And she said to me, she thanked us for coming there as the Western world to cure them of leprosy. But she said, now our people are healthy, you're back. And those people are ending up back in Europe or in your countries, and they're being exploited. If they weren't healthy, you wouldn't want them. These were chilling moments. And I think that when you look at supply chains with businesses making millions, when you see governments who are paying lip service to this, now is the time we need to show real leadership. We're 20 years down the line since the Palermo Protocol, and we're not seeing the progress we need to. And we need to have honesty. Unless we look at ourselves, unless we look at what the problem is, we will never come up with a solution. And sometimes that means an admission that we're not doing a very good job. It doesn't mean that individuals aren't doing a very good job. Together we might not be. So I think the time is now, the time is right for us really to take a look at what we're doing and what we're achieving, perhaps to reset so that the next 10 years of the SDGs are really meaningful. So by the time we get to 2030, perhaps that 14-year-old girl will see a change in the world, and the woman in Nigeria, we can tell her that actually we've done our best to stop this. So thank you very much.